Star Trek Discovery might be on a little hiatus, but here at Star Trek Weekly, we're not, and we're going to ask a really important question this week. Are the JJ Abrams movies garbage? Stay tuned to find out. Star Trek Weekly starts now.
You're tuning into the destination for TV superfan discussion, AFTERBUZZ TV. And now, let the buzz begin.
Well, the song was in 2 of the 3 JJ Abrams movies, so it really wasn't that hard of a decision. Welcome to Star Trek Weekly. I'm Christian Bladt. You can find me at Christian DMZ. For those watching on YouTube, to my left, your right, Kari Lane, where can people find you?
Hey, yeah, how's it going? Oh, wait, can you hear me? There we are. Yes, you can find me online at Kari D Lane. That's Karidlane.
And at the other end of the desk, Frank Moran, where can people find you?
At Happy Go Jackie.
And nobody is more happy go Jackie than you are.
Thank you,
so here we are. We're going to spend the whole show talking about the 3 JJ Abrams movies. So in my mind, that gives us about 15 minutes for each of them. And I know that if I don't keep an eye on the clock, I'm going to probably spend most of the show on Into Darkness. So, what I want to start off with first, we'll jump right into it. And obviously, if you're watching in the chat, please join in, give us your thoughts, what you think of any or all of the JJ Abrams movies. Obviously, we're talking about Star Trek, parentheses 2009, Into Darkness, and beyond. And we're going to focus on those. I want to kind of start off talking about the casting for these movies, because when it was all announced and they were all putting it together before I'd ever seen any of the movies, I'm like, well, this is great. I like these actors. I didn't know Zoe Saldana before this, but obviously we all know her now. John Cho as Sulu. I guess he's the only Asian guy working in Hollywood, but I've always really liked him. And my wife's Chinese, so she's very partial to the short list of Asian actors. So she was very excited for Star Trek, which she might not have been if weren't in it. Obviously Simon Pegg as Scotty, Chris Pine as Kirk, who I was not familiar with before Star Trek because I wasn't a big Princess Diaries guy. I know it sounds crazy, but I really wasn't. Zachary Quinto as Spock. I mean, who else were they going to cast? And good timing for him that they put this together when he was still a fairly big name on TV. Love Carl Urban as Bones. The unfortunately late Anton Yelchin as Chekhov. And that's kind of the core crew. But I think that they're all great. Kari, what do you think of the cast, sort of these representing these classic characters?
I think representing was done well and decent representation. Though Star Trek, had a good blueprint to start with the previous one, so they just picked more contemporary actors.
It's interesting because when you update a lot of things, like a good example would be the reboot of Battlestar Galactica. You'll change some of the ethnicities and some of the genders, but Star Trek had done a fairly good job with that. You didn't need to we should probably have a female minority for Uhura. Oh, wait a minute, we already did. Yeah. And obviously having a Russian on board the Enterprise was a much bigger deal in 1966, but I still think it's very interesting.
I forget the statistics, but I know I've seen posts about it, but I'm pretty sure Star Trek, the early show, was one of the first of having many different ethnicities featured the way they did. So it's okay, there we go. Maybe that's...
Is your mic cord being unruly?
Do what?
Push the whole thing away from me. I know he's very far away.
How's that?
Steve in the booth, I think,
okay,
is...
am I hitting it?
He's mid-transport right now, so we can't
he's
really
not
hear
beamed up fully.
But
overall, they were many of the actors I had known of them from other projects they had been in, so I was excited to see them all together, and yes.
So, Frank, when you heard that, before we dive into the movies themselves, that this was the cast, what did you think?
Interesting. I feel like this, if you were going to tell me before this all came up, we're going to recast Star Trek or, say, Star Wars. I mean, I feel like these are kind of really iconic characters, really associated with the actors that originally portrayed them, that I feel like there was a lot of, scrutiny about who are we going to be able to get to play these younger versions of these well-established characters.
Yeah.
And I feel like these were solid choices. Carl Urban probably being my favorite out of all of them.
I think so. Yeah.
But I felt like if pretty much just any property I can think of, the way they set this up and introduce it all, this is a property that is suited and tailored to a great way to make this. It's still to get something new, but still address people's that ever struck canon feel.
Do you think it would have worked better? Do you think you would have been happier with it if they did sort of just the approach of like Star Wars Episode 7, where there's like a changing of the guard? You got some of the old cast, but it's going to really be about these newer characters. And then, you know, we have obviously, you know, a couple people wouldn't have been able to be a part of it, but when it started, you still could have had Spock, you could have had Kirk, you could have had sort of older versions of them. Would you have liked a Changing of the Guard kind of new character movie, or just complete new characters, no old guard?
Knowing how I've the stance that I've made since episode 1 of Star Trek Weekly in regards to Discovery, how I've wanted it to always go forward.
Yes.
If I was going back and I had the chance to say, JJ, go backwards and do a reimagining, or go forwards, I would have said go forwards. Let's go see it. I mean, certainly if you do put in a couple like Spock or a couple other, you get a shout out from John, Patrick Stewart coming in as Jean-Luc Picard, some like touchstones to kind of help launch it.
Yeah.
But to do something new, I would have been more excited to do that. I don't know if they would have been as successful in the box office with a bunch of just unknown characters. I don't know if it would have crossed over to mass box office.
And I think that's the difference. If you were doing a TV show, you could have new characters, but for a movie with the amount of money involved, you need to put those characters in there, you know? And I think, again, to reference Star Wars, I think that was a big concern. It's like, no, people are going to expect to see these characters. You have to put them in the movie. So people want to see Kirk and Spock. And if you're going to not have old Kirk and old Spock, let's go ahead and recast all of these parts.
Well, they set it up really well for fans who know Star Trek, because they're like, okay, here's your characters. Let's show them like younger, which that happens a lot with movies. They're like, here, let's do a young version of them, because then it's, you know, you don't necessarily worry about the older actors. But then it was a great way to bring in new fans, because I bet many people maybe have never seen an episode of Star Trek ever, but they probably have seen the movies, the new ones. And so it was a great bridge for that.
I know people here at AfterBuzz who've gone back and watched older Star Trek episodes and movies, but their way in was the 2009 Star Trek.
It's a good gateway drug.
Yeah,
and
right.
saying
exactly.
it's an alternate like world, perfect way.
Well,
alternate dimension.
It's an alternate timeline.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that was a good way to bridge it. And you had like one or two little things. They're like, all right, cool.
I
good.
wonder if Frank felt the same way as I'm watching this movie, and then there's the very clear distinction made. No, everything you've seen before still happened. There is this divergent point, and we're now in a different timeline. I think Star Trek, more than any property, you have to make sure that everything that they've seen and invested in still happened. And you're not saying, like, yeah, you're going to have to forget about all that. You know, because, like, a good example would be James Bond. There's a lot of, like, yeah, that didn't really happen. Don't think about that. That doesn't tie into this.
Forget the girl he was with last
right,
time
right,
that he
exactly.
pledged his love
it's
to.
a lot of that, you know?
Forget that bad guy.
You know, with the Star Wars movies, again, to go to it, they just sort of shook the Etch-a-Sketch and was like, yeah, all the novels and comics and everything for the last 30 years, yeah, those didn't happen. And I think Star Trek fans, as unhappy as some might have been with these movies and with the Kelvin timeline in general, like yourself, if you had undone all of that, and this is like, nope, this is the beginning now, what we're doing, I think the outcry would have been much greater, and maybe it would not have been as successful. Do you agree?
I agree. And I think you bring up a good point. Like with the Star Wars, I mean, the expanded universe basically happened in video games, books, comic books. Didn't really have any film or television shows kind of showing that, which kind of makes it more canon if you actually can see something on screen. So if you want to just kind of discount the whole forward progress and say, like, hey, now we're going back, we're doing actual films, sit back and we're kind of revisiting the timeline, I think that's an easier pill to swallow. Like with Star Trek, since if you were to go back and reboot the whole continuity and imagine that everything, both novelizations, comics, TV shows, films, everything was discounted, yeah, that would drive everybody crazy.
Yeah, it would have been 40 plus years is like, thanks, but no thanks. You know, it's all over.
It'd be almost like disrespectful to the franchise of all the hard work they've been put in.
And here's the thing, what we got, some people feel was disrespectful to the franchise. And I think that it was important to have a divergent point.
Oh, yeah.
And let's talk about the movie itself, Star Trek parentheses 2009, which we have to be specific. I'm glad that they didn't call it Star Trek the Motion Picture 2, or, you know, like there's a lot of different ways, different permutations. I really like this movie a lot, 2009. There's definitely some things that are, you know, obviously you're just like, oh, I don't know, this isn't really Star Trek. But for me, it was great because I love those characters, and they're able to have a different spin on them because of the divergence in the timeline. And from that point forward, we kind of get to meet them, and it's a little different than the story we'd been told before. And there's just some interesting things. There's lots of little surprises, you know, like Spock and Uhura, things like that. But I think that one of the biggest criticisms of all the JJ Abrams movies from more diehard Star Trek fans that I know myself are that there's just too much happening. And I'm like, so your problem is that they're too exciting and too fast paced? And I think Star Trek as a TV show was always slower because it was a TV show. But Next Generation is a perfect example. There's all those scenes, you know, in the ready room where they talk about what's going to happen and they need to map it out because it's a TV budget. And you just have to, we're going to talk a lot, and there's a lot of talking. The movies don't have as much talking because they're like, we're going to, instead of talking about it, how about we blow some shit up? And we have like sort of a you know, fast paced like fight scene. So I appreciate that, even though it's not necessarily the Star Trek that I'm necessarily used to. Not that I find Star Trek boring in any way. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the pacing is a lot different in these movies. But I'm still able to enjoy them.
Would you say that for all different seasons of Star Trek? I know early on it was very different, but it's also a different time period of when it came out.
Yeah, no, it's different. But I mean, and that's the other thing. It's just the way that you make a movie. I mean, these movies are so different than just earlier movies.
Yeah.
It's just what people want from their entertainment now and what their expectations are, you know?
Totally.
I mean, you would never make a movie now like Star Trek the Motion Picture, which we'll do a whole episode on at some point. Just the amount of time they spent showing you the Enterprise, it's really cool because it's a big screen, but especially when you end up watching it on TV years later, you're like, okay, we get it. It's a cool ship, but it, you know, you would never have that kind of pacing now. And and I think that, you know, even Star Trek 2 onward, they're like, yeah, let's really hit the ground running a little bit more.
Well, I feel like it's interesting if you look at Wrath of Khan, which probably my favorite of all the Star Trek films. And I think a lot
we
of
will
fans,
also do an episode with that. I want to have our friend AfterBuzz chief Kevin Undergaro on the panel to talk about Star Trek 2 because of how important that movie is to him. So around his schedule, we'll do that at some point.
Look at that. But if you look at the way that Nicholas Meyer treated that with the space battles, very much kind of like submarines, kind of transporting that into space. This definitely picks up the action in terms of space battles. Kind of gives you a little bit more of a fast-paced feeling than you normally see like traditional Star Trek films, which not bad at all. I mean, I kind of interesting to see a little bit more fast-paced.
Yeah. Well, would you say you like this movie, Frank? And I'll ask Kari the same question.
I mean, you know, certainly. It bought a lot of goodwill towards me by just doing the time loop and the alternate timeline to making everything count, to see Leonard Nimoy come back as Spock.
Yeah.
You know, it's always like I love what I see on the screen, or enjoy what I see on the screen, but there's always those little bits like I wish that you know, William Shatner and JJ Abrams could have kind of reached some kind of accord where like, yeah, let's get a little bit of nod of Kirk in there or something like that. Always those things that you wish that you could have seen. That had been speculated and talked about but never reached fruition, that I'd love to have seen in the film as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely understand that. Obviously, Kirk is so iconic, but at least Spock as a Vulcan, a little bit further along down from, you know, Star Trek Generations, you're like, yeah, he's still alive. It kind of makes sense, and he's still... the inclusion of Leonard Nimoy in this movie, I'm being very specific, in this movie, I was very happy with, and I thought it was well done. Kari, what did you think about the movie in general?
I think when it came out, I absolutely loved it. It's been a while, and I think I probably rewatched it for the subsequent sequels. But it was just so fun, and it was action, and I'd been, you know, seeing some of the older Star Trek films, so it was like a really great way to adapt it to today and today's audience and new fans. The other thing, though, that was funny for me when I watched it is the opening sequence when he's a little kid is almost the exact same opening sequence, or very similar to Treasure Planet, which I kind of vaguely mentioned last time.
Yeah, that's right.
It's him. If you guys haven't seen Treasure Planet, it's an awesome animated movie. But both are a young man racing on like futuristic vehicle and getting pulled over by the cops. But that sounds very vague, but it's very similar. Like, I was watching the movie, like, they stole this from Treasure Planet when I watched it. But I was like, but that was a cool movie and a cool scene. But it was just kind of funny of like, hey, wait a minute, I've seen this before.
For me, I like the big thing was like the score, because like James Horner's
Yeah.
scores for the original Star Trek films are so ingrained. Like Wrath of Khan, still such a great soundtrack. That just waiting to see how JJ Abrams was going to treat the Star Trek theme, or what kind of score he's going to come up for this. And I kind of dig it. At first, I was kind of like, I kind of was a little resistant to it, but I mean, I dig it now. Like now, listening to it with a little time.
Yeah, and as I don't know if I mentioned on the show, but I mentioned conversationally with you, Frank, that a couple years ago at the Hollywood Bowl, they had a screening of this Star Trek movie, Star Trek parentheses 2009. I wish there was a
With the
better
live
title for
orchestra?
it. Yeah, with the live orchestra. So
Nice.
all the sound effects and everything were intact, but they'd stripped all the music out, so there was live orchestra. And it was great. It was such a great way to see the movie, and I hadn't seen it in a couple years. So I think that this sort of tied in. It was like a little bit before the release of Star Trek Beyond, unless I'm mistaken. So it wasn't actually that long ago. But anyway, it was a great way to see it. And when you see it that way, you really like appreciate the score. And I thought that it was great when I saw the movie in the theater. I believe I saw it twice in the theater. Both times I saw it in the theater, I was like, yeah, this is great. But then you see it like that, it reaches, I think, another level. Before we move on to the next movie, I want to talk about Eric Bana as Nero, as a villain. He doesn't seem like your Star Trek series villain, but he's definitely reminiscent of some of your Star Trek villains in the movies. You know, I think he was a great character, and just his blind rage of trying to, hurt Spock, and his misguided usage of red matter and time travel. This just happens. You know what? Time travel is not for everybody. That's what we learned. Not everybody knows how to do it right. I thought that he did a good job, and it was sort of a nice thing that was definitely new, introduced in the course of this series. What did you think, Frank?
He was okay. Certainly I feel like you buy, and I keep going back to Wrath of Khan, one, because I enjoy it so much, but certainly has one of the best villains. But Khan is great only because we also get to see him in Space Seed, so you get a little bit of backstory right when you come into Wrath of Khan, for those of you that are familiar with the original series. But still, he just brings the right tone in that film that I feel like you get to know his pain and why he's so... It's set up so much better in that film that I felt
That's
like...
a great point, yeah.
That this one, I just felt like... he from his point of view, he definitely does have a reason to be mad at Kirk and want revenge. For this one, for Nero, as he's explaining the story, it's just that Spock was just too late to get there. He tried, and by the time he got there, everything blew up. So, but he's mad. He's taking it out on Spock for no other reason than it's like, I couldn't get there in time. I apologize.
Yeah, for Spock's time management.
Yes.
He creates a whole divergent timeline. Carrie, what do you think of Eric Bana as Nero in this film?
I kind of agree, Frank, and I just felt like one of those, like, you didn't quite get his motivation enough, so you're kind of, you couldn't feel enough for him either way in terms of, like, appreciating him as a villain or hating him as a villain, because you're like, so why?
Yeah.
What? I think you needed a little bit more for him to really, I felt it was very detached, like, I don't know who this person is, and I need a little bit more.
Yeah. Go ahead. You seem...
Oh yeah, this so with Nero there, but I want to ask you one question before you hop on there. Like watching this again, it was great to be able to watch it a couple nights ago just for this. But there's a little bit of sequence to get Kirk onto the Enterprise since he's kind of under suspension at the time. McCoy kind of injects him with a virus, and then we go through as he's doing the remedies. His hands get all puffy. He starts losing
Yes,
that.
that was funny.
Watching, I was like, I don't know. I mean, do I need to see that little bit of comic relief? Does it do much?
Yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is funny, but I agree with you. I don't know that you needed that comic relief, but they obviously felt like that was going to help heighten the moment. And yeah, it didn't need to be lighter, but it doesn't. But I know exactly what you're saying, and I don't think... I appreciate where you're coming from with that. It didn't bother me, but I can completely see what you're saying. And yeah, maybe we don't need it, and maybe that is just like... Well, I don't know, there's the youngest part of the audience will enjoy that part maybe. And sometimes you make your movie with kids in mind, sometimes you make it for international international audiences.
Do you feel like this question is like, certainly this is that divergent timeline.
Yeah.
So the Kirk that you're watching there, I would say out of everybody, especially Kirk and Spock, but more so Kirk. Like watching him go through the academy, stuff we never really saw in the original series, but I've always heard talk about Kobayashi Maru, whatnot. Do you feel that the Kirk that we're watching in this is the Kirk that kind of reminds you of original series Kirk, or are you willing to discount the differences simply because it's that divergent timeline?
I think you have to discount the differences because it's a divergent timeline, because you feel like you know, the actual James T. Kirk didn't get into the same kind of trouble as a kid as the the Prime Kirk, as opposed to Kelvin Kirk. And yeah, I think that there are a lot of differences. He seems a lot more like Kirk from the animated series. No, I'm mostly saying that as a joke. But yeah, you don't quite feel like it's the same character. And I think a lot of times, anytime you get prequels, reboots, or things, sometimes it is hard to reconcile, you know, these characters with what you've seen before. And yeah, they do feel different. I would say, to your point, Carl Urban as Bones, and to maybe a little bit of a lesser extent, but Simon Pegg as Scotty do feel the most like their characters. I'd say Spock is very consistent, but at the same time, this Spock seems a little bit more human than Spock when we meet him in the original series.
Okay, well, within the context of this being an alternate timeline, and even just a reboot, essentially, too, would you guys have wanted carbon copies of those people, or would you like it being different enough? Because it's like doing a cover of a song. You know, unless you get it exactly right, it's just going to sound wrong. So it's better to do a little bit do more of a difference, because then you're not just comparing it constantly to what you know.
Yeah, go ahead.
For me, it's like, yeah, there's that sweet spot that I want with Kirk, where I feel like in this film that he's too much of the time he's getting his ass handed to him, and I want to see and I guess you have to excuse that because it's an up and coming Kirk, so he's not the full fledged Kirk.
Yeah.
But I still want to see my full fledged Kirk, even though I know I shouldn't be getting him.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You're both right that it's a little different, but it's probably better that it's a little different for the stories they want to tell. What I'll say is that the Chekhov in these movies feels very specifically like Chekhov in Trouble with Tribbles. He's like the silly Chekhov, who he's not always the silly Chekhov, but for me, that's the Chekhov that I was particularly fond of, and I guess you get that a little bit in the feature films with the original cast. So anyway, well, we could break that down forever, but of course we should also give the shout out to George Kirk in this movie, who would then go on to become Thor,
yes, and
Jennifer Morrison as Winona Kirk. But and we hear his voice actually shows up in. I think it's in Into Darkness. He gets a vocal credit, Chris Hemsworth, because there's like a very faint sort of recollection that Kirk has. But anyway.
Oh, and this changes the stakes too in terms that Vulcan gets destroyed.
Yeah,
that really.
Well, that's a great point. I'm glad we didn't skip over that entirely. Yeah, it completely changes who this Spock is. Is that, you know, and it would have made sense if he's like, well, I can't do Starfleet anymore. I mean, I have to try and help, you know, the Vulcan race continue. And the fact that Spock Prime is there is like, no, you can still do that. This is really important. You're going to do important work. Believe me, you should do it. And yeah, I think it's interesting that they did that. And that's a perfect reason why this had to be a divergent timeline. If you're going to destroy Vulcan, I think that it's very important that you have it be in a different timeline.
One last thing I want to ask you about that is just, what do you think of the redesign for the Enterprise? Because certainly we all know, like, Warp Core, it's very much more of a smaller space. This, like, it's an industrial plant that they shot in where it is super huge.
It's
tons
so
of pipes.
big. I know.
Does that seem crazy to you, or do you feel like, all right, I'm buying this kind of upscale look?
I think it's sort of like what we talk about in Discovery. It's like, you know what, things can look cooler now, and they can be more detailed. So you have to suspend the disbelief. I agree that it doesn't. Imagine if it looked like the actual bridge of the original Enterprise, you know, the NCC 1701, no A, B, you know, none of that. But I understand that they you know, it's like, we have all this money, we can make it so big and look all, so I'm okay with it, but I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, it doesn't bother me, but let us know if you're in the chat, either watching live or if you're watching the archive. Leave a comment and let us know if you have any problems with the way that the Enterprise looks. Let's definitely move on to Star Trek Into Darkness, which is, I'd say, the most divisive entry in this series, the three. And, you know, longtime Star Trek fans tend to agree with the idea that, at least initially, the even-numbered Star Trek movies were the good ones. 2, 4, 6, Undiscovered Country, and then First Contact. And then Nemesis and Insurrection threw it off, because for me personally, neither of them were very good. So, and then this sort of continues that, just opposite. So like 12 is not the best one, but I like the other two. I don't dislike this movie. I think the fundamental problem, you referenced him earlier, is if you were so dead set on having Khan in this movie, you needed to embrace it. You didn't need to try and keep it a secret. And I think that built up a lot of bad will, that people are like, well, I think it's Khan, but I'm not sure if it's Khan. You have to own that Khan's in this movie. And look, Benedict Cumberbatch is a great actor, but he's not Khan. He's not even close to Khan. I found it took me out of it a little bit. I'm like, this guy's Khan. And, you know, I hadn't seen Sherlock yet at this point, so I actually hadn't seen him in much of anything. And I was like, really? This guy's Khan, you know? And it was very distracting. And I look, it goes back to box office. It goes back to money. It's like, well, if you put Khan in the movie, but then you don't advertise that Khan's in the movie, so what was the point in forcing him into the movie and just having another villain in that role, like somebody else, you know?
Well, especially because, I mean, they deliberately said, no, he's not Khan.
Well, they even went that far and they
Yeah.
said he is not Khan. And they're like, well, why did you do that? Because he is Khan.
Yeah.
And he's not a great Khan, you know? I think that there's a lot of things about the movie that still work for me in spite of that. But right at the middle, the center of the movie is Khan. And, you know, Kari, you probably don't have the same connection with the character that we did,
but-
especially not when you saw it. So what did you think of Benedict Cumberbatch as the villain in the movie, not really having ties to the previous incarnation of Khan?
I do agree that Benedict Cumberbatch is an amazing actor, and I don't know if I had seen Sherlock when I watched it, but I thought he was a great actor. But I remember, I can't remember if it was when it just came out or what, but people were upset on representation for that character. Like, that character is someone that they could have made a person of color.
Yeah, there was talk about
Yeah.
Benicio del Toro and some other actors maybe
Or
being in
even
the
you can have someone Indian. His name
Sure.
is Khan.
Yeah,
It's
no,
like-
I mean, he was sort of a mixture, his background, so he could have,
Could have been something else.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't have maybe had as much name recognition, but you could have found somebody. So I don't know. I can't remember if I had that in my head when I went in or after, so it left a little bit of
sure.
this dude, like, why him? I don't remember enjoying this one as much as the first. Like, also the thing is the first kind of wins in a way because it's like that new one.
Yeah.
So then this is like, all right, how does it measure up? But I remember I enjoyed it enough. But yeah, I don't have the same, like, pillar that he needs to match up to.
Yeah.
But I do know he's a very important character, and many people love that film and are that's it. Like, people know the quotes from it, or, you know, the reference, or they know who it is.
They make sure that you remember some of the quotes in this
Yeah.
movie because they very awkwardly stuff them into this movie.
Yeah, so-
And those moments really all fall flat for me personally in this movie. Frank, your thoughts? We'll get to the movie as a whole, but
Yes.
your thoughts on Khan being in the movie and the callbacks to specifically Wrath of Khan.
Everybody knows Wrath of Khan at the end when you've got Spock and Kirk, and they flip this on this, and I just felt that it kind of fell flat to me.
It also kind of cheapened, which is such a great movie. Well, it's a great movie, but a great moment in that movie. The idea that, you know, there's nothing that Kirk can do to help his friend, and they actually talk about being friends, and it's so significant.
Yeah.
All of that, it's such a great moment. And then when you just flip it around, it's almost, and it's not a lighthearted moment, but it's almost like you're kind of making a joke out of it, you know?
Because I feel like any emotion that you're bringing into that scene is you're bringing it in from the original Wrath of Khan.
Yeah.
You haven't been around these characters long enough to have that emotional investment to this particular death scene.
Yeah.
So when this happens, you're kind of like, it's a callback and it's a flip, but it just doesn't land with the emotion that it should. And I feel like you're just trying to use whatever goodwill you've got from the original source material.
Yeah. So your thoughts, Frank, on the movie as a whole?
Like,
As you're watching it the first time, just sitting there in the
Yeah.
theater, what do you remember thinking and feeling?
the thing I didn't like about it is that I felt like they just kind of knocked Kirk back. We had to kind of go through
Yeah.
Kirk learning all the ropes again.
As I'm watching it, that's my biggest annoyance. Before I even am certain that Khan's in the movie, I'm like, wait, again?
Yeah.
Like, he why do we have to do that? Like, you know, it's only the second movie. Like, what? You know, we don't always have to have Police Academy back in training.
No.
You know, one Police Academy back in training is enough. We don't need to do it with Captain Kirk. And it drove me crazy, actually. I'm just like, but it's not even for a great reason. I mean, that opening sequence in this movie is so great. And it's so great that I actually paid money to see a Hobbit movie I didn't want to see, because you could see the first 9 minutes of this before the Hobbit movie, months before Into Darkness came out. So I was like, great, I'm going to go see this. And it ends, and I'm like, wow, that's great. I'm so excited for Star Trek Into Darkness. And then it's almost like, well, kind of the rest of it's not like that. It's like that, they're a crew, they're firing on all cylinders, they're working together. I'm like, this is so great. And there's some real good like Kirk and Spock moments in those. I think it is 9 minutes. I remember specifically how many minutes I paid for. And then there was like 2.5 hours of Bilbo. But the 9 minutes was great. And yeah, and it's just to have that be the reason why, oh yeah, so not so fast there. And yeah, it was just so unnecessary. I'm like, no, we already got him to getting closer to the Kirk we want him to be. Why is he like back down to the previous movie's Kirk? I agree. That drove me crazy, and that's before we even got to know that Khan was in the movie for sure.
Yeah, and we've got some touchstones to the other film too with Carol Marcus.
Yeah,
introduced.
Which when you jump ahead to Star Trek Beyond, no mention of her. We don't see her.
No.
And I expected that. Okay, that's cool. She's introduced. All right. Well, we'll see what they do with it. And you know, again, another iconic character. And is she just in this because they're borrowing so heavily from Wrath of Khan that they feel like she should be in it?
Yeah.
And I was just like, what did they do with her? You know, and I mean, her dad is the other admiral, which it's some great conflict. It leads to good moments of storytelling. But again, it's just like, well, why is she in this movie?
Isn't this also the like online underwear scandal thing too?
Well,
Yes.
yeah, which was something that, and honestly, I forgot that happened in this movie. And then you're like, oh yeah, right. I remember now that there was a lot of apologies for it. You know,
Well, because as I recall, it was the scene where she's in her underwear and people just felt, or the people who were upset felt it was unnecessary for her like.
so
It was.
yeah, I'm not going to say that I was sitting there thinking that I'm upset in this moment, but I did think it was very unnecessary. And
you're like, wait, why?
Like, why? And then sometimes you're just like, because you know it's movies, and you know she's an attractive lady. Let's have this
see, that's a bad
inexplicable.
slide,
well,
though,
it
to be
is,
like,
and
sure.
it's something that you used to get a lot more in movies, not in the 21st century.
Yeah,
and
well,
I
there's
think
better
that,
ways to throw in. You could have had. There's other ways to use like disrobing and changing.
Yeah. Right,
So.
and I think that they just weren't clever enough
Yeah.
to do that. I agree, and I was excited that the idea that we would have gotten to actually know Carol Marcus
Yeah.
because she's introduced in Wrath of Khan is like, oh no, like Kirk,
That
like
was
he's
weird.
known her forever. Don't worry, and you're like, well, I don't think I know her, but you know, and it would be. I'm like, oh, that'd be fun. She'll be on the crew.
Yeah.
Well, she's not.
Like, no.
But yeah, I definitely agree with you, Frank. That was on my list of things I wanted to talk about this movie.
That, and then I also just felt like some of the action sequences were just kind of reprises from the first one. Instead of
Yeah.
like diving down for the mining drill, now it's just diving across to another ship.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, can't we think of another better action sequence?
Yeah, and it's very cool to see Spock in an action sequence because it's not really something
Yes.
that we got because it was always like, well, Kirk's going to do it. And just to see Spock, you know, get, you know, because look, obviously he's stronger than humans because he's Vulcan, but also, I mean, mentally
He's
and physically.
trained.
So it's great. It was very cool to see, and that's one of those in the moment. I'm like, I don't know if I need this, but I'm enjoying it. You know, like while I'm watching it in the theater the first time.
Did you feel like though that I thought he should have held his own a little bit better
Yeah.
against Khan? I was like, I know he's like genetically enhanced human, but come on, you're a Vulcan.
Yeah,
I thought it'd be a little bit more.
You should be able to
evenly
take.
matched.
Yeah, you should be. Yeah, you know, like you could still have a
Struggle
tough fight
a
on
little
you.
bit,
Yeah, but there could, you know, you could get a couple of good punches in. I definitely agree with you, and yeah, so
My biggest issue, though,
Yeah.
is the tribble. So, of course, we inject
Yeah.
the tribble with Khan's blood, which I like. We go through the Enterprise almost burning up in Earth's atmosphere. Everything's getting all disheveled on the ship, but the tribble is still sitting exactly where we leave it, right there at McCoy's desk. Comes back to life at just the right moment. And then McCoy says, we need Khan's blood. You've got 72 other of those same beings in cryostasis right there in your medical bay, but we need specifically Khan's blood? You don't. You have any one of these other people you could have gotten it from.
that's just one of those, like, how many rewrites and polishes did this script get? And at no point did somebody go like, you got to fix that. Like,
on.
you can still go from A to B, but this isn't how you can get, like, don't get there this way. Like, yeah, I definitely agree there. Just, and sometimes it's as simple as this thing that doesn't make sense. We need to do it for this reason. And Star Trek's usually very good about that. And you're like, okay, at least they addressed it. You know,
Exactly.
and sometimes
Yeah.
it's like, just give us that. Like, don't treat us like we're idiots, because clearly we're not.
I will say though, for all these films, they do a good job of at least giving, especially I feel like Scotty and Uhura, more stuff to do than they ever got to
Yeah.
do in the original
Yeah.
films and series.
Yeah, and Sulu
they're,
as
like,
well, especially in
fan
the first one.
favorites,
Yeah,
kind of.
yeah. I mean, those, especially just over time.
Yeah.
And the later movies, they got to do a little bit more. But yeah, really, they usually sat there and pushed buttons. I mean, obviously, there's plenty of episodes. You know, we've all seen Sulu with his shirt off fencing. But you know, that is the reason you remember stuff like that is because it's very rare. It's mostly they're there to push buttons.
And so in Into Darkness, Kirk gives Sulu the con as he takes off
Yeah.
and he goes on this exploratory mission. And Sulu gets all nervous, like, "Oh, I've never been in the chair before." Like, but he gave you the con in the first film too. So why are you so nervous about it? You've already done it once, buddy. No need to be so
You
nervous.
forgot already.
You
Yeah.
forgot. We're rebooting everybody back to zero on this, which is
Well,
irritating.
it's just one time, so he's like, I don't feel confident enough about it.
Well, and we didn't do this for the last one, but if I'm going to give a letter grade to this movie, I give it like a C minus. You'd still graduate. You're not going to get left back, but it's like, oh, this could have been great, even with Khan in it. I think that Khan. All my things I don't like about it kind of stem from there. Even with him in it, you still could have made this a great movie. You could have still told some version of this story, and it still would have been good. But it was just they just tried too hard, and I think that it was a lot of pressure because the first one was so successful. And they're like, you know, look, did the studio say you have to put Khan in this movie? Maybe, but at this point, you could tell us that now, 5 years later.
Yeah.
You know, I'd be like, yeah, you know, I didn't even really want to put Khan in there. They clearly were like, oh no, I think that'll be fun.
I felt like one little thing that was kind of nice in terms of playing the divergent timeline is originally in Wrath of Khan, it's all about Spock and Kirk meeting, and it's about Kirk getting older.
Yeah.
Feeling the passage of time, you know, what can he keep doing as he's getting older? And I like this is when we've got Scotty, with Bones and Kirk getting together. It's about his, it's not getting older, it's about his birthday reminds him of the death of his dad. And so
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of a nice touch. You kind of see how a birthday affects him in two different timelines.
That's actually a really great point, and it's true that there are those moments like that they just really nail, and it's like, yeah, that's interesting. But on the whole, it's basically it's a very average movie.
What would
which
you give the first one then?
I give the first. I'm going to say I give the first one an A because I was just look. It had been a while since there had been a Star Trek movie. It had been a while since I'd really enjoyed a Star Trek movie. First Contact was the last one that I enjoyed before the 2009 Star Trek. I didn't hate Insurrection, which I believe was your first Star Trek movie. I think you told us. It was just so average and not that exciting. And I was like, oh, it's like a 2-part episode of Next Generation that somehow I missed. And here it is, you know, great. But I didn't feel like and the Nemesis was just wrong in a lot of ways. I didn't like it as much. But Frank, are you able to give letter grades to these two movies? And
Yeah,
I'll have to
I-
ask you the same thing, Kari.
I'll go with an A for Star Trek only
Yeah.
because I feel like the difficulty of achieving a successful film, given all the pressures on it, and how do you reboot a franchise, I thought that did well. I'll go with C because it's watchable but irritating
Yeah.
for Into Darkness.
Yeah. What do you think, Kari?
Definitely first one gets an A. Are we putting C as like...
So it like a C, if you're using the 100 scale, it's like a C is like 75, 74.
No, but I mean like,
you know?
okay, A is like, wow, that was really good.
Yeah.
B is like pretty good.
Above average is
and then
B.
C
C is
would be
just
like-
very
is okay.
average. Yeah.
I would be between a C plus, B minus because I didn't dislike.
Yeah.
I didn't dislike it. Like
You
that's,
didn't
I
have a
feel
lot of the
s-
baggage that
Yeah.
Frank and myself and a lot of people had. So you're able to
Understandable,
enjoy
yeah.
it more. No, that's great.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have been able to enjoy it more
I'd
objectively.
say more of a
but-
B minus because like I don't remember going, ooh,
Yeah.
I don't like it.
Yeah.
Which I would put something in a C where I have moments where I'm like, I don't like it.
Yeah. Well, let's in our final 10 minutes here, let's move on to Star Trek Beyond, which I liked a lot. You know, sort of the thing I just said about Insurrection. This feels like there's been an ongoing, you know, Star Trek Kelvin timeline TV series, and I just fell behind and didn't watch it and was like, oh, just watch this one
Or jump
because it's
back
like
in it,
because it's like
jump
the
back in.
third year on their 5-year mission, and it's like, oh, I think it's really well done. I think it's fun. The characters are nicely established, so we don't have to really deal with too much of that. And
Do you agree though? I mean, because I feel like the whole part of it at the top is Kirk getting burnt out.
Yeah.
He's year 3 in the 5-year mission and he's burnt out. I feel like, man, like Kirk on the. I mean, he was a guy that just loved being on the mission.
This
Yeah.
is him at the beginning.
But in the original, I mean, it's certainly it's a divergent timeline. Who knows? But I feel like Kirk is the guy that always. I mean, he wants to be in the captain's chair and he wants to be going. out
The
there.
interesting thing to that, you feel like, yes, it bothers him. It's worn on him, but he's feeling it more that he knows his crew is like a little bit burnt out. You know, so I think it's almost like he's projecting on himself, like, yeah, you know what? How can I help the crew? You know, it's like I don't know how many times you can go on shore leave. You know, I like, what do we do to make it not feel like this? So I think it does go back to the fact that this is a different Kirk. You know, I think he just sees the world a little differently. He's a much more spoiled child Kirk than the one
that's a
that
good
we
way to
had,
describe him.
because as we meet this Kirk, he's a very spoiled child, and that's sort of always in the back of your mind. And yeah, I don't know. I thought that this did a good job. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to go back to Into Darkness. The inclusion of Spock Prime in that movie as like a bad plot device of, you know, I can't violate anything, but if I did, I'd say don't trust Khan. I'm like, he didn't need to be in there. I'm sorry, that bothered me so much. I think I got to go to like D+. No, I won't. I'm going to keep my grade. But that bothered me so much that they put him in here. And you know, obviously you weren't able to put Leonard Nimoy in Beyond because he had passed away. And I think addressing it and having that moment where, you know, Kelvin Spock, for lack of a better way to classify him, just has to deal with the fact that like he doesn't have that guidance of his future self to talk to anymore. And of course, I love the fact that the press photo from Star Trek V is something that he has framed, because we all want to remember Star Trek V. But I think that that's sort of a very nice touch, and getting to see this Spock in that way and how it affects him. Obviously, it really impacts his relationship with Uhura and just what all of this meant to him.
I feel like that was getting a little tiresome too, where we got both in the second film and the third film, we get issues with Spock and Uhura.
Yeah,
little bits that have to be kind of.
Oh, there was
addressed up.
some drama relationship stuff. I'm like, was that in the second one then?
it's actually hard to keep. To
Yeah,
keep
the
it
second
straight.
one
But
is about him like being in the volcano and like willing to sacrifice himself.
Yes.
And then the third one is him about wanting to leave Starfleet to go
Yes.
to
No,
New
no,
Vulcan.
the Ohura, like their relationship
Yeah.
issues.
Yeah,
It's
it's-
more in the
it's-
second, and
it's
then
both
it
the
bleeds
second and
into
the
the
third.
third.
It's both the second and the third.
That was
In the-
like a plot
in-
line that you're just like,
in
okay, just
in
have
the
a
third
discussion.
one, it's like obviously he's not going to be
Yeah.
very communicative. I feel like it didn't take away as much in Star Trek Beyond, but having already had it, you're right. It's like, okay, we get it. You know,
Yeah.
It's hard to date a Vulcan. We
They're
definitely
called
get that.
words. You use them to communicate,
Yeah.
guys. Like, just have a talk, please.
Yeah.
That was something where you're like, I don't know.
But yeah, go
I was
ahead.
gonna say I looked it up because I was like, what was the character's name? I don't know how you say her last name, but Sophia Batula.
As Jayla.
Oh,
yeah.
that character is pretty darn cool.
I
A new
thought that
random person that you're like,
introducing her, and
Alien.
I've heard rumblings that at least at one point there was a plan for a standalone movie with her going through Starfleet. I don't know that we'll get it because sort of the results on this was a little bit mixed, and that is a great character that I thought helped move things along, and it was interesting. It was somebody different. And I
an
liked
alien.
her relationship with the ship. And then when it comes to Crawl in this movie, I completely forgot that Idris Elba was in this movie.
I just saw him like, oh yeah, he was.
No. When I'm watching the movie, I knew he was in it, and I'd like, oh wait, that was it. Oh, it's the same. I just was like, oh, I'm an idiot. I was just like, that was one of those moments I'm like, oh, if I wasn't so dumb, I probably would have connected it. But yeah, and I love Idris Elba as an actor, so I was just excited that he was in something. His British series Luther is amazing police drama, but that's obviously for another time. So I thought the inclusion of both of them in this movie worked well.
It was great too because by then the regular crew is already this great cohesive unit, so we don't need to like introduce them, but we get that with these new characters.
Yeah. So Frank, what did you think about the new characters and the way the movie kind of worked as a whole?
I felt like one, I was kind of tired of watching it because I watched it like back to back to back.
Yeah.
So seeing like, oh, we got another starship crashing again. I was like, some of this, like, I guess there's only so many things you can do with the starship. I guess it's either
yeah, it
crash it
crashes
or you blow
hard.
it up.
Yeah, and how many times have we seen an Enterprise, whether it's the original, Enterprise, and then Enterprise A, and then the D and the E, like there's like a torture porn quality to it. I'm like, I don't enjoy seeing the Enterprise
Oh, it
destroyed.
hurts in this
Yeah,
one too.
yeah,
You're
this
just like,
that was actually that's on my list as like my biggest thing. I was just like, I did not
Yeah.
need to see the Enterprise again.
It's like you want to cry because you're like, it's like part of the characters. It's
Yeah,
their family.
when they get rid of the original Enterprise in Star Trek 3, the Search for Spock, I guess technically to some people this is Star Trek 3, but anyway, you know what I mean. That was really impactful. That like meant a lot, and you're like, yeah, this is a ship that they've been on for 20 years. And yeah, they have to sacrifice it. This is just like, whatever, we'll just get another one, who cares? So yeah, I don't love that. I don't love the.
As a viewers, we care.
Yeah.
I never feel the attachment of Kirk to the Enterprise. That
This
I did.
Kirk, you're talking about
Yeah,
this
this
Kirk
Kirk.
to this Enterprise. I
Yes.
definitely agree with you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm just like, I miss that kind of like, me and the ship
It's
are
his
like one.
baby.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Never
No.
quite feel that. Yeah, I guess it's interesting in terms of the crash. It kind of gives us some pairings that we don't normally get to see a lot in depth. We get to see, Kirk and Chekhov.
Yes, that was good.
It's always great to see Spock and McCoy kind of run around and do the thing.
Yes, anytime that and obviously we're talking about the prime Spock and McCoy, but also this Spock and McCoy. I love the dynamic of Spock and McCoy. I can really put up with a lot in a movie or even an episode if we're going to get some good Spock and McCoy stuff. I think Star Trek 3, which I just referenced, has some really good Spock and McCoy stuff for obvious reasons because Spock's trapped in his head. And I think, I definitely agree. We get some of that in here. And I remember watching it, I'm like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted. I want more Spock and McCoy. We only have a few more minutes.
One of the things that we also have the familiar theme that I think we got in all three films is people falling, and we've got to be able to transport them while they're in motion.
Yes.
Yes.
We get that so many times, and I always laugh that we lose, Spock's mom. We can get Kirk and Sulu as they're racing down, almost about to hit there, and Chekhov's able to get that, but he's not able to get Amanda before she falls. I'm like, you just did that with all right, okay, fine.
It's
All right,
just
whatever.
because it comes down to the transporter doesn't work as well when you have an expensive actress like Winona Ryder, and it's like, yeah, we can't get her. I think that the comedy in this movie it works very well. Simon Pegg did a rewrite on it,
Yes.
and I think that's very clear. Not just because he gave Scotty maybe a lot more to do than he would have if he hadn't written it.
But that was nice because you liked that character
Yeah,
enough.
no,
You're like, yes,
I
give me
was
more.
very glad to see that. I
And
liked.
his buddy, the
Yeah,
little,
oh,
I'm like
the-
gesturing, I'm like, the little
The
dude
little guy,
with him.
yeah. For those not
Well, that
watching,
was hilarious.
I like that. I like his friend. I like his interaction with Jayla. I liked all of this, and I thought that it was a lot of fun to get to see. When comedy is not done well in look, comedy is great in Star Trek 4. It's really bad in Star Trek 5. They try too hard. This I felt like was a nice balance, and I thought it worked. And just as a nerd, I liked that they had the ship that they find has like the Star Trek Enterprise uniforms and just the tech. So there's like a very clear nod to what had come before.
Do you like that? This is the first one that's not directed by JJ
Yeah.
Abrams. It's Justin Lin doing it this time. Did you like the change up of directors for this?
Right up until there was the obligatory dirt bike sequence.
I was just thinking, like, that sequence is interesting.
that was definitely the moment where it's funny. My friend Will Sterling, who I do, he's on my podcast, the Blackcast that I do. When he saw the trailer for this, and you see Kirk on a dirt bike and a lot of the action, he's like, so it's Too Trek, Too Furious, obviously, because Justin Lin. And you're like, yes, that's exactly what it is. And that is the moment when you actually see it, and you're like, okay, I guess. But
they did cool stuff with it.
They did cool stuff with it, but it definitely takes me out of it a little bit, and I think
Okay.
that's a new director.
enough.
And look, we used the song at the beginning, but did we need the Beastie Boys Sabotage in 2 of these 3 movies? There's other music they could have used.
Yeah, but it's a nice callback to Kirk.
No,
I didn't mind
it
that.
is.
I forgave
I didn't
that
mind
one.
it, but I'm just
Yeah.
I remember thinking after the fact, it's like, it's fun, it's a great song.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's nothing else. But that's fine.
There is one moment
Yeah.
where I felt like this kind of really captured the original chemistry from the original series and films, where Spock says, "All right, hey, yeah, if let me take over one of the ships, would you let me do it if I bring somebody that's really familiar with both me and the ship?" And Kirk just says, "Oh, he's gonna love this." Just that line. It's like,
Yeah.
all right, you got that dynamic between all of them. I really enjoyed that.
I agree. Yeah, and there's definitely look. All three of these movies definitely have some sort of like nods to how invested we are in these characters' relationships already, and I think I look and I alluded to how the box office was kind of a mixed result. I do feel like there'll be another Star Trek movie with this cast. We don't really have time to delve into it too much, but Frank, you had an understanding that there was a plan that they were going to do something. I remember this now that after you mentioned it. Well, talk quickly about
that
it.
they were gonna. The idea is that they'd go back and close off the Kelvin timeline by going back and trying to save the Kelvin, perhaps bringing Chris Hemsworth in as George Kirk and try to seal it all off and kind of close out the Kelvin timeline, which I think would be cool to be if they could close it all off. Say this is just like four films that kind of dealt with this, and now we're back in the prime timeline. Would be kind of cool.
Yeah, no, I think that could be very interesting, but I don't quite know what the future beholds for Star Trek movies, but here's the one thing you can be sure of. There's going to be another Star Trek movie at some point.
Yes.
It's probably going to come from Bad Robot and JJ's people. I think that in general, Paramount's been happy with how these were received. And I think that they felt like this was critically a step in a better direction, but I feel like that ultimately they were happy. I would like to see more because I like this crew, and we've only had 3 movies with them. What I don't want is another reboot with other actors playing younger versions. Like, let's not do that yet. You know, and look, it's tough because obviously, unfortunately, as I mentioned, Anton Yelchin passed away right before this movie came out, and there is a really nice moment at the end of this movie where they're all having a drink, celebrating, and they linger on him a little bit longer than you feel like they would have in the original cut of the movie. And I think that's a nice moment. So you run into some things like that it'll be interesting to see. But, if somebody's not available, don't recast everybody. Let's just see what they do. But I would like to see more. And we're essentially out of time. But I give this movie, it's a solid B for me. I enjoyed it. I had fun with it. But it's, it wasn't perfect, but I was much happier, and I'm happier thinking back and rewatching this than I am thinking back on Into Darkness and rewatching Into Darkness. What do you think about Beyond?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm like, okay, so the first one's like a good solid A. I'd say the second one's like a B. I'd say this could be like an A minus of like, it was almost as fun as the first one. It didn't have as many of the problems as the second. And then also by then you get the like camaraderie of these people and they have their togetherness as well.
What did you think, Frank?
I'd probably give this a B. And I'm wondering, like, if we never imagine we didn't get another Star Trek film, but it was going to be with this cast, but it would say be like 8, maybe 10 years before we saw the next one. Part of me almost kind of like that to kind of get them a little aged up.
Yeah.
We kind of
That'd
like
be interesting.
we let the time kind of like get us a little bit more attached and fond of these characters.
So you're saying you want them to encounter V'ger in the next movie? Is that what you would like?
Yep, that's right.
That's it. You heard it here first. So the question posed in the title of this episode: are the JJ Abrams movies garbage? It kind of sounds like no. Like, it's not what we're saying. There are people who feel that way, but we're not those people. If you feel that way, or you agree with us, either way, please let us know. How can they do that?
Leave comments down below.
That's right, if you're watching on YouTube or comments in iTunes. So next week, we'll do something very controversial. We're going to rank all of the captains of all the different series and movies. So I'm giving you a week. That's all right. Yeah.
Captain Giorgio is included.
Can I get
Giorgio will be
bullet
on the
points
list.
on all of them?
You can. Yeah. I'll send out a list, but it'll be the captain of the show or movie.
Yeah.
So because a lot of times we'll meet other crews and things, and we don't need to go that deep. But I have to really think about it because I'm not 100% sure as to who my number one is. And that doesn't mean that it's Riker by saying number one. But anyway.
Are we including Enterprise B in this?
I think we have to. I didn't really think of that, but I guess we have to. We have to go through all the letters. Anyway, so that'll be next week. You can put your thoughts together and give us your suggestions in the comments, in the chats. But we are out of time. So for myself, Christian Bladt, at ChristianDMZ, and for Kari.
Yes, you can find me online at Kari D Lane. That's KaridLane.
And Frank.
Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at HappyGoJackie.
And we will be back next Sunday at 10 Pacific, ranking the captains and admirals, I guess, of Star Trek. So we will see you next week. Live long and prosper.
From executive producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire AfterBuzz TV staff, we would like to thank you for listening to the AfterBuzz TV network. To watch or listen to other after shows and post comments or questions, be sure to visit AfterBuzzTV.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of AfterBuzz TV.
Buzz you later.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of AfterBuzz TV or its owners or principals.